From the moment the Lakers paired LeBron James and Luka Doncic on the same roster, everyone sensed it had the makings of a blockbuster. What nobody anticipated, however, was that the film would spiral into a full-scale catastrophe. According to multiple sources, the fallout from the Lakers' February 24th loss to the Orlando Magic didn't stay on the hardwood. It detonated in the locker room. The two stars reportedly got into a heated confrontation so intense that teammates were forced to physically step between them before the situation spiraled completely out of hand. And that's just where the story begins. What follows is a breakdown of everything. What ignited the clash, what was allegedly said behind closed doors, and the long, troubling history of LeBron's fractured relationships with his co-stars. A pattern exists, and once it comes into focus, it's impossible to ignore, especially when you factor in what Shaquille O'Neal and Charles Barkley had to say about the whole ordeal. What we are watching unfold in real time may well be the most expensive, highest-stakes ego conflict the sport of basketball has ever produced. If the Lakers' loss to the Orlando Magic on February 24th looked like just another forgettable regular season stumble to you, then you missed the bigger picture entirely. That night wasn't simply a basketball game. It was a 48-minute chronicle of why placing two alpha personalities on the same roster, particularly when one of them is LeBron James, is a blueprint for self-destruction. The tension was palpable from the opening tip, but everything came to a head in the game's final 6.7 seconds. The Lakers were trailing 110-109, the season's momentum hanging in the balance, the crowd at a roar. Luka Doncic had been the offensive engine all night, racking up 22 points and 15 assists, and he came off a screen in perfect position, wide open at the three-point line, exactly the kind of look he has converted countless times throughout his career. But instead of allowing the most gifted playmaker on the floor to operate freely, LeBron James began calling for the ball from the perimeter. Luka hesitated just a fraction of a second, but in the NBA that's an eternity, and ultimately delivered an uncomfortable, reluctant pass. LeBron caught it with 5 seconds remaining and launched a turnaround fadeaway that hit the front of the rim so violently it nearly sent a courtside camera flying. The buzzer echoed. The Lakers had lost to a team they should have handled by 20 points, and LeBron was the first man off the floor, exiting without a single word to his teammates. What made the blood boil even more was the detail that most people glossed over while debating the final possession on social media. If you went back and rewatched the fourth quarter, you'd notice that with the Lakers trailing by 1, LeBron stepped to the free throw line for 2 shots and converted the first, only to clank the second off the back of the rim. Had he made that shot, the game would have been tied and the chaotic final sequence never would have occurred. Yet instead of owning that failure, LeBron walked to the post-game podium with a composed expression and redirected attention toward Luka. When asked about the last play, he said he wasn't sure what happened and suggested reporters ask Luka what he saw. Noting that he thought Luka had a good look, he made no mention of his missed free throw. He said nothing about his 5 turnovers. He simply allowed the narrative to calcify that Luka's hesitation was the reason they lost. The contrast with Luka's own press conference couldn't have been starker. The Slovenian star stood before the cameras and absorbed full accountability, saying he needed to be better and that the loss fell on his shoulders. He acknowledged seeing an open teammate, admitted he was reluctant to give up the ball, and conceded he should have attacked rather than hesitated. That was a leader speaking. What happened next transformed a rough night into a full-blown crisis. Luka didn't retreat home and let LeBron's comments dissolve into the news cycle. After wrapping up his own media obligations, he had already showered, dressed, and had his bag over his shoulder, prepared to leave the arena. He had carried himself with dignity in front of the cameras, even accepting partial blame for a play that everyone watching had seen clearly. LeBron demanding the ball and missing the shot. Luka was moving calmly toward the exit, still stinging on the inside, when a teammate stopped him in the hallway and held up a phone. LeBron's clip was already going viral. The quote hit hard. Luka went stone cold. Here was the man who had poured everything into that game, who had dragged the team on his back all night, now learning that his co-star, the supposed leader of the franchise, had gone on live television and made him the villain. His jaw tightened. No outburst yet. Just the kind of icy, dead-eyed composure that anyone who watched his EuroLeague days would instantly recognize. He turned around and began walking back toward LeBron with deliberate purpose. LeBron was still seated near the media area, headphones on, scrolling through his mentions as though the narrative he had planted was taking root exactly as planned. A few teammates clocked the approaching storm and moved to intervene. They called out to Luka to cool down, but the moment had already passed the point of no return. He walked directly up to LeBron, got into his face, and delivered the message with a low, glacial calm. "Don't ever put my name in your mouth to the media again." Those were the words of a man who was finished tolerating mind games and manipulation. LeBron didn't absorb it quietly. He shot to his feet so fast his headphones flew off and clattered to the floor. For a brief, surreal moment, it looked less like a locker room and more like a pay-per-view weigh-in. The confrontation turned physical almost. Immediately, shoving, jersey grabbing, fabric straining, chairs knocked sideways. The shouting grew loud enough that security personnel stationed outside rushed in to assist. It ultimately took Austin Reaves and Marcus Smart physically planting themselves between the two men to prevent things from escalating into something that would require a police report. And in a detail that stunned even those present, LeBron wasn't attempting to de-escalate even as half the roster held him back. He was still yelling that Luka needed to grow up and learn how to close a game. To understand why a 41-year-old NBA legend was directing that kind of venom at the clear face of the franchise's future, you have to reach back into the earlier months of the season. Earlier this year, Luka had effectively shut down LeBron's efforts to carve out a meaningful role for his son Bronny alongside him. And according to insiders, LeBron had been quietly seeking an opportunity to reassert dominance ever since, even if the collateral damage involved torching the team's locker room culture. The friction had actually been telegraphed publicly. Marcus Smart, appearing on a podcast, had already told anyone paying attention that LeBron and Luka barely communicated unless cameras were present, describing it as a working relationship, which in NBA terms translates roughly to a mutually tolerated coexistence built on contractual obligation rather than genuine camaraderie. By the February 27th game, even that thin veneer had dissolved. Video from that night captured the two walking into the arena a full 20 feet apart, with no eye contact, no acknowledgement, no greeting of any kind. This was a feud that had been building for months, and the body language made it impossible to deny. When two franchise cornerstones refuse to acknowledge one another in a public corridor, a season doesn't just struggle, it flatlines. And the numbers provided cold, clinical confirmation of exactly who was responsible for dragging the team down. The irony of LeBron pointing a finger at Luka became almost comical when the analytics were laid out plainly. The so-called king had, by 2026, become something closer to a liability, a LeBron tax, as it were, that the Lakers could no longer sustain. The data was unambiguous. When Luka Doncic and Austin Reaves shared the floor without LeBron, the Lakers posted a plus 11.9 net rating, elite, championship-caliber basketball with fluid ball movement, clean spacing, and Reaves genuinely involved in the offense. The moment LeBron entered that combination, the rating collapsed to a minus 2.5. Reaves was reduced to standing in the corner waiting for kickouts, the offense stagnated, and the chemistry that made the Luka-Reaves pairing so effective evaporated. He was clogging the paint, obstructing Luka's natural flow, and quietly diminishing one of the team's most productive partnerships, all while presenting himself as the indispensable veteran anchor. Even the Lakers' own pantheon of legends had grown fed up. Byron Scott, a three-time champion and one of the defining figures of the franchise's Showtime dynasty, delivered a direct and unambiguous verdict. He said he believed this should be LeBron's final season in Los Angeles, clarifying it wasn't a comment about the end of his career but specifically about his tenure with the Lakers, concluding simply, "You don't have to go home, but you've got to go." It was a remarkable statement, a franchise icon publicly calling for the departure of the team's marquee name. But Byron Scott was saying aloud what the rest of the organization had been whispering for months. The broader Lakers family was exhausted by the spectacle of watching their storied franchise held captive by a veteran whose priorities increasingly appeared to center on personal branding and family legacy management, rather than team-first basketball. Charles Barkley had been making essentially the same argument on ESPN for some time, insisting with conviction that this would be LeBron's last season in a Lakers uniform because he was actively dragging the franchise backward. The cost of all this dysfunction was being paid by Luka Doncic, a 27-year-old entering the most explosive years of his career, now trapped inside a system architected to make an aging star feel relevant rather than to maximize the team's potential for winning. The criticism wasn't limited to analysts and retired players. Some of the biggest names in NBA history had weighed in. Shaquille O'Neal, who typically tries to maintain a degree of diplomacy out of respect for his connection to the Lakers organization, had reached a point of visible frustration with how LeBron was managing the situation. On his podcast, Shaq openly questioned whether LeBron still possessed the competitive hunger required to lead a team through adversity, pointing out that genuine leaders, the kind he played alongside in Kobe Bryant, or the kind he himself embodied, take the final shot and absorb the consequences if it misses. His central argument was that a leader cannot claim the throne during the good times and then retreat into the role of complementary player the moment the pressure becomes real. He called it exactly what it was: ego preservation. Charles Barkley, characteristically less restrained, went further. During a segment on Inside the NBA, he labeled LeBron's post-game comments about Luka as inappropriate, whiny, and entirely out of line, and argued that a recognizable pattern had taken shape. Whenever the Lakers found themselves under serious pressure, LeBron's instinct was to identify a teammate to absorb the blame. The tension reverberating through social media and across television panels was not an isolated phenomenon. It was a reflection of something deeply embedded in the franchise's DNA, and the current situation bore little resemblance to the legendary conflicts that came before it. The Shaq-Kobe era was defined by genuine mutual hostility. Kobe believed Shaq was physically gifted but professionally undisciplined. Shaq viewed Kobe as selfish and allergic to sharing the ball. Their disagreements were visceral and sometimes physical, literal altercations in practice, screaming matches behind closed doors. Yet the moment the lights came on at Staples Center, all of it was suspended, and they channeled that friction into 3 consecutive championships. They never went running to reporters after regular season losses to drop carefully worded passive-aggressive commentary about their co-stars' decision-making. They despised each other and still had the discipline and respect for the game to keep that ugliness private. LeBron's approach was the polar opposite, feeding the media apparatus while the team's internal culture quietly disintegrated. Even the Magic Johnson era, which had its own share of internal conflict, unfolded in an entirely different context. In 1981, Magic famously grew so frustrated with coach Paul Westhead's plotting, restrictive system that he gave the front office an ultimatum. But Magic was young, ascending, and legitimately the future of the sport. He was pushing the game forward into something faster and more electrifying. LeBron, at 41 years old and approaching the final chapter of one of the longest careers in basketball history, was doing something far more troubling, effectively doing to Luka what Westhead had done to Magic, forcing a generational 27-year-old talent into a constrictive, outdated framework designed not to win championships but to keep an aging star statistically relevant. And unlike Magic, who fought to evolve the game, LeBron was fighting to freeze it in place long enough to stay in the spotlight a little longer. This dynamic pointed to what might be described as LeBron's most potent off-court weapon: a media infrastructure sophisticated enough to reshape narratives before the final buzzer has even sounded. Whenever a disastrous performance, say, 5 turnovers against the Magic, threatens to dominate the conversation, the machinery begins operating almost immediately, ensuring that by the time the headlines land, LeBron's co-star has somehow become the story. The pattern had repeated itself across nearly 2 decades with remarkable consistency. Kyrie Irving was portrayed as the destabilizing force who couldn't handle the environment, despite being one of the most technically gifted playmakers the game has ever produced. And after LeBron went to the media to publicly suggest the team needed better playmaking, Kyrie eventually concluded that being anywhere else in the league was preferable to spending another day in that shadow. Kevin Love experienced a similarly demoralizing treatment, including a widely publicized tweet from LeBron that essentially told him to conform or leave. Public humiliation delivered through social media rather than an honest private conversation, with Love later describing the psychological toll the environment took on him. Russell Westbrook's situation was perhaps the most cynical of all. LeBron personally lobbied the front office to acquire him, then went silent as the crowd turned on Westbrook, never once standing up to acknowledge that the roster construction had been his idea. The conclusion of all this was not a mystery. In 2026, when LeBron stepped to a podium and steered the post-game narrative toward Luka's hesitation, it was the same play he had been running for 20 years. Absorb the statistical glory, contribute to the failure, and redirect the spotlight onto a teammate. The Lakers now stood at a genuine crossroads, one whose resolution would define the franchise for the better part of the next decade. The most alarming dimension of the whole situation was the possibility that LeBron remained the only person in the building who didn't recognize that the armor had already cracked. The locker room confrontation marked the first time in 2 decades that the machinery had failed in real time, publicly and undeniably. Luka Doncic hadn't merely stood up for himself in that hallway. He had, in a sense, stood up for every player who had been fed through that system and spat out as the designated scapegoat, from Kyrie to Westbrook, demonstrating that the old playbook loses its power against a new generation unwilling to accept the role of villain. The question facing the Lakers organization, and one its front office was plainly reluctant to answer, was whether the franchise intended to be a legitimate championship contender, or whether it was content to serve as the final chapter of one man's legacy tour.